I would like to start a few comments, remarks, and then hand it to Tzvi to continue, and especially for you, Konstantin, because you are our guest today, and we are very reluctant to hear according to the biography that I have. I would like to start with some condolences to Tzvi for his mother passed away a few days ago. And I know that Tzvi tried to demonstrate that this was the future because he knows the medical situation of his mother, but mother is a mother, and especially a Russian mother. I know what does Russian mother, so Tzvi, on behalf of me and Hiking Chair and HMS, we would like to convey our condolences. Then, Konstantin, you know that we are very eager in our center to hear some perspective about the Russian strategy, and especially their strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't know if I can say that they have a written strategy or explicit strategy, but I think that by the way that they are demonstrating it, we could judge what is their ambitions here. Some of our participants take this as a PhD thesis, so I think that they are very eager to hear it from you, and they would like to ask a question. So this is a privilege to both Hiking Chair and HMS to host you. I would like to thank Tzvi to assisting us to create such an opportunity, and Tzvi, I handle it to you to present Konstantin.
Okay, so I am very glad to represent you, my friend Konstantin Negard, one of, in my opinion, a leading Russian political analysts and commentators, that I know him already 12 years. Okay. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Toda Rabba. I'm very glad to be able to speak to such an informed and interested group of people, because for someone who is in the public eye, it's very important that that you have really interest coming back to you. I thank Tzvi for the introduction. He's indeed a very old friend, family friend, I can say now. And just to add to the story, we met first in actually the last day or two of Russian invasion of Georgia, which actually set our conversations for the next 12 years very firmly, among other things, in the field of military strategy and military and security and foreign policy. I also would like to thank Shaul for this introduction. Just a few preliminary remarks. I'm not a military analyst as such, and my speciality is Russian foreign and domestic also policy. As you see from my CV, I did a few things in my life, and I was always focused, and it fluctuated actually. Sometimes I was more focused on Russian domestic policy, sometimes more on foreign policy. I think foreign policy takes a bit more of my time generally. I also worked in the corporate sector, so I do know a couple of things about how Russian economy works. But for the purposes of our conversation today, what I wanted to say is that I will try to put what happens in Russian foreign policy, and specifically in East Mediterranean and in the Middle East, in a wider context of Russian policy, not only foreign policy. And some stuff I'm going to say may sound, well, probably a bit unusual. And of course, questions and answers are exactly for you to probe me on this. And I will start from one very important thing, that Russian foreign policy is not, and it's not unusual, but as frequently in authoritarian countries, Russian foreign policy is not a foreign policy that emanates from a very clear understanding of Russian national interest. or a country's national interest. It very much stems from the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, in fact, has been unable to find, at least not yet able, to find its new identity, its new understanding of self, and by extension, a specific set of national interests that will reflect both certain national values and certain national perspectives. It's probably not, it's not for now to go deep into how the collapse of the Soviet Union impacted the Russian mind, but it suffices to say that among all the countries that used to be Soviet republics, Russia and probably to some extent Belarus are the two which suffer from this complete lack of identity, complete lack of understanding of where they stand compared to others, even to Ukraine, which is pretty chaotic. That's number one. Number two, Russian foreign policy, because of the fact that not only the identity issue hasn't been settled in Russia, but also because of the fact that it is not a democracy, is not it's not very widely discussed because there are very few forums to discuss it, and pretty much no way for the public to impact this policy. As you probably know, Russian state media is fully controlled by the Kremlin. Elections in Russia are just pro forma things which are supposed to make Vladimir Putin and his handpicked bunch of Duma deputies kind of to go on as they were now for 20 plus years. There are no independent politicians to speak of, and when they suddenly show up on the scene, like Boris Nemtsov, not so suddenly though, they are bumped off or kept in the very, very cold corner like Alexei Navalny. And I think that in these circumstances, what happens is that foreign policy is essentially Putin's foreign policy. It's unchecked. The real decision-making machine in terms of Russian foreign, military, and security policy is not the Duma, is not the defense ministry. It's this thing which is called the Security Council, which is actually only recently has been more or less constitutionally validated. It is a collection of people that includes, of course, Vladimir Putin, who is the head of it, Dmitry Medvedev, heads of FSB, SVR, defense minister, interior minister, prime minister, basically all top decision makers, who get together every once in a while, we don't know when, and basically more or less agree on certain issues. The main person in this council is Putin. His is the ultimate decision. So when you read in whatever, in Haaretz or in Ma'ariv or listen on CNN that Lavrov said something or Shoigu said something, respectively the foreign and defense minister, don't even pay attention. Switch to the weather. Switch to Netflix. Because neither Shoigu nor Lavrov have any real impact on policy. Well, probably Shoigu has a bit in tactical issues. But generally, the decision-making is made by Putin in the presidential administration. He is the final word. And this word can't be debated. If Putin tomorrow decides to invade the Baltic states, no one can prevent him from doing that. So a very important issue is that this foreign policy decision-making is made completely under wraps. And another important thing, you might think that this is something that, well, is not exactly unknown to authoritarian regimes, but a bit risky because it's still, you still have to carry responsibility for what you do. And here comes another very important thing, which is, I would say, in modern dictatorships, is not very frequent. this foreign policy, which includes, by the way, Syria and hobnobbing with Turkey and all these kind of things, has another role to play, which is also very domestic and very, very important. In the absence of national identity, imperial nostalgia, Soviet nostalgia, this desire to recoup the perceived Soviet greatness is a very important, if not the most important part of Putin's personal legitimacy and authority in Russia. This is actually what makes him tick. So forget about coronavirus and Russian hospitals that are creaking under a lack of budgets. Forget about the aging country, which is actually in a permanent demographic decline since the days of Khrushchev. Forget about brain drain. Forget about a lot of other things. The only way for Putin to maintain his authority is actually to continue this foreign policy, which, in his view, brought him a lot of benefits. It brought him a spike in popularity after invasion of Georgia. As we discussed then with Tzvi, in 2014, it brought him unprecedented unpopularity after he annexed the Crimea and started, let's face it, an unsuccessful war in eastern Ukraine. And it gave him quite some popularity when, as you know, completely out of the blue, on the 29th of September 2015, he suddenly sent his Air Force and Desantniki and Marines to Syria to help Bashar al-Assad. It so happens that this idea that Russia has to somehow wrestle back the Soviet glory, be the number one on global stage, be on par with the United States, is a very, very important element of modern Russian political life. If it wasn't there, Putin wouldn't have been there. So for Putin, invading Syria or continuing war in Donbass is not just a foreign policy issue, which he can suddenly decide to forget about. It's the lifeblood of his popularity and, what is even more important, his personal vision of himself. Putin increasingly lives in a world in which he's surrounded by, well, sort of, 18th century style court, which tells him what he wants to hear. And it tells him that he is the greatest person in Russia since Stalin or since whatever, Peter the Great. Putin is writing his page in history. So for him, for lack of any big success in Russia, foreign policy, including Syria, including East Mediterranean, is something that it's actually the only thing that he can use to leave his name for posterity. And because of this, of what I started with, because of Putin's personal obsession with foreign policy, and because of this imperial nostalgia, which is being fed 24/7 by the state media machine, by propaganda, what we have essentially is a very interesting situation. Russian foreign policy is actually centered on one country in the world. This is the United States of America. So the sun for Putin and his team rises and sets in one place, which is called Washington, D.C. So pretty much everything that happens in Russian policy is about America. It's about proving to America that Russia needs to basically play on the level of America. It's about recognition of Russia's right to control its immediate environment. It's the so-called near abroad. It's about letting the Russian regime alone, and that's very important. Russian policy with regard to the United States is dictated by this desire to basically recoup the losses of the Cold War, convince the Americans to let Russia, convince the Americans to conclude the so-called Yalta II agreement, basically an unofficial understanding that Russia has a right to control the former Soviet Union and has a right to say yes or no to NATO enlargement. And finally, a lot of comparisons are made now with the Cold War, with the days of Khrushchev and Brezhnev and late Stalin. I think a lot of them are true. But there is one very specific thing. As opposed to the Politburo of the old, which used the same Chaka limousines, went to the same dachas, had pretty much the same salary, the new Russian leadership under Putin not only rules Russia, it also owns it wholesale. We can speak about Russia Incorporated. Who controls Rosneft? Not Igor Sechin. It's, in fact, Vladimir Putin. Who controls Yakutia's diamonds? Is the Kremlin. Who controls Gazprom? Is the Kremlin. Who controls the arms sales? It's the Kremlin. It is a weird, not a weird, but it's an interesting nuclear power type of state capitalism, to some extent comparable to the Chinese, where all profits are private, all losses are the taxpayers. And in this respect, Putin's foreign policy, or his immediate circle's foreign policy, is not only about foreign policy, as it was for the Politburo, as it was for Brezhnev or Gorbachev. It is about their own assets. And in Russia, as opposed to, say, the United States, it's not money that breeds power. It's power that breeds money, that brings you assets. So, in a sense, we are destined to have a very difficult relationship with Russian foreign policy, basically not I, but you, because business decision-making, the fate of Rosneft, the fate of Gazprom, the fate of arms sales is completely interlinked, is one and the second with Russian foreign and security and military policy. This is complicated because you can never guess what these people really think about foreign policy, what they are really going to do. And because of that, Putin and his team has a very unhealthy obsession with regime change. Of course, all authoritarians don't like the idea that some pro-democracy forces, I don't know, will come and bring them down. Look at Venezuela, look at China. But in Russia, it is a very specific obsession. Ever since the Ukrainian 2004 revolution, the first Maidan, the Orange Revolution, Putin is obsessed with regime change. Putin is obsessed that eventually America, working through NGOs, journalists, whatever, and disloyal oligarchs will bring him down. So, ever since Georgia, but especially ever since Ukraine, or ever since Ukraine wanted to conclude its association agreement with the EU in 2013, Putin's main goal in foreign policy is to prevent regime change. And to do that, he wants to show to the United States, first and foremost, that he can't be touched, that he is the globe's foremost authority on countering regime change. So if you're a dictator in Chad or in wherever, in Bolivia or Venezuela for that matter, come to me, I'll save you. Syria, and here we come closer to the region, is the best example of that. You have all these interesting colleagues from, especially Europe, some from America, saying, oh, you know, Putin went to Syria in 2015 because he wanted to retain the Tartus and Latakia naval stations, or because he thought something about Syrian oil, or because Assad is an old friend of the Assad's family, is an old friend of the Soviet Union, or because of this and that and whatever. No. Well, these things, they play a certain role, but imagine you have a Saudi-backed regime in Damascus Do you think that in exchange for overthrowing Assad, the Saudis wouldn't have agreed for Russia to keep, well, basically something that is not a huge naval presence in Syria? If they said, okay, yeah, do what you want with Assad, but just leave us alone there, no problem. I don't think it would have been a problem. Putin went into Syria, first and foremost of all, to show to the world that he is the world's most reliable dictator. Okay, authoritarian ruler. Look, if you're a friend of the United States, like Hosni Mubarak, and you have a problem with Tahrir Square, you call Barack Obama and they tell you, well, you know, Mr. Mubarak, could you please call in a couple of hours, the president's playing golf. But if you call Vladimir, if you're a Bashar al-Assad and you call Putin and say, well, you know, Vladimir, I have a problem. I have these guys basically moving into Ghouta and then shelling my presidential palace. No problem. Tomorrow, you have Russian Marines, you have Russian Air Force, and so on and so forth. So, if you're an authority, if you're a dictator, who do you want to have for friends? In a sense, that was, I think, the most important element of Putin's policy in Syria, which came against the background of an extremely weak and inefficient Obama administration. There were basically, it's telling Washington, don't touch me. Look, I can reach out very far. I'll defend my interests wherever you are. The same goes, for example, for Venezuela. It's not only about Rosneft money. It's about an interplay in America's backyard. Another reason for going to the region was, of course, also distracting attention from Ukraine, which in 2015 was a very big issue for Putin, not so much now. Number three, of course, as Defense Minister Shoigu said, it's a wonderful testing range for Russian weapons. Live fire exercises every day, that's fine. I think that in this sense, Putin was to a certain extent successful. I mean, in 2015, Assad was in a really bad shape. That he's still there 5 years later, well, yes, he did succeed in something. But I think that involvement in Syria brought Putin exposure, which probably to some extent he did not expect to get. One thing pulls in another. That he had to interact with the Iranians means that his previously more or less pragmatic and tenuous alliance with Tehran is now much more close. And in case the United States or Israel decide to move significantly, seriously, militarily against Iran, he'll have to make a very unpleasant choice, whether to stand with the mullahs or to duck out of the whole thing. Another element, just giving an overview, is Turkey. You can't ignore Turkey. Putin thought that he can play a bit with Erdogan, who is also an authoritarian, and that is important for him because pulling Erdogan towards Moscow means pulling him away from NATO. And that means pulling him away from the United States. So if you look at the S-400 sale, it's not only about selling Russian missiles to Turkey to basically like try and ground a bit or root a bit or anchor a bit. It's Russia's relationship with Turkey because of Syria. It's also about showing a middle finger to the United States. And I think that in a sense, you have a situation in which today Putin is, you can say, a winner or tentative winner, provisional winner in Syria. But he's also a hostage of the Syrian situation. Because once you make such a high bet that you will keep Assad in place, that means you have to keep Assad in place all the time. You can't have some kind of compromise, because that undermines your original purpose of going to Syria. I suppose that there is another thing which is more in the realm of psychology, and which, by the way, pertains to Israel very, very significantly, which is important in Putin's ranging or making hierarchy of his friends and enemies in the Middle East, and especially Eastern Mediterranean. And that is his perception of strength. As you know, Putin is a kid from a very, very disadvantaged, poor background, who is, or used to be, very streetwise, who was probably beaten up significantly by his peers before he joined the judo section. Putin's main criterion on which he judges people is strength. So strong or weak is the first yardstick which he will use to assess anyone or any country, any player strategically. It's both personal and political. And this obsession with strength is very much part of his thinking. Because of that, for example, people are saying, well, Putin's and Erdogan's relationship is very, very fragile, because the Turks shot down the Russian plane in 2015. Actually, it's one of the strengths of this relationship, paradoxically, because there are other things that weaken it. But after Erdogan shot down the plane, Putin figured out that Erdogan is strong. If he's strong, he can be respected. He can be respected, he can do business with Erdogan because of that. So Erdogan always is going to be given an extra consideration, because Putin remembers that he shot down the plane. So maybe he can do something another time. And the same goes for your country, Israel. Because of Putin's specific background, and having served in the army, having served abroad in the late Soviet years, I can tell you that I met a lot of Putins in my life. Officers of his age, exactly at the time when I served, born in early 50s, not ardent communists at all. They understood the system doesn't work. Not Democrats, people who thought that it's actually the KGB that should run the Soviet Union, so it's going to be all fine after that. And what's very important, people absolutely obsessed with conspiracy theories. Among them, of course, one of the main ones is this obsession with Jewish influence in the world. It may sound ridiculous, but Putin's relationship with Israel, including his current relationship with Netanyahu, is very much based on his ages-old, late 80s, KGB obsession with Mossad being the most effective intelligence service in the world, with Israel never letting any crime be unpunished, with Israelis always extricating their pilots, their POWs from whatever, the clutches of Hezbollah or whoever, the Arabs. So Putin perceives Israel as a very strong player. And because of that, he wants to ensure that Israel never interferes in his actions or doesn't create problems for him. And because of that, being in Syria, he maintains this hotline with Netanyahu, because Israel, in his view, possesses a lot of strength. One thing he doesn't want to pick up a fight with is Israel. Not only because of Israel itself, but, as I said, because I think, well, I'm satirizing just a bit, but I think a lot of people around him, at least, believe in all these tales of, you know, Rothschilds being able to bring down the ruble anytime they want and so on and so forth. I may sound ridiculous, but I'm not. And I think that because of that, this relationship with Netanyahu, or whoever is going to be the next Israeli prime minister, is very, very important. Now, for the last bit, after that, I'll open for questions. To sum up, Russian policy in your region generally, and we didn't touch upon Libya, but that's, you may ask me, I'll talk to you about it, is very much based on the idea of what I could call advanced prevention of American encroachment. I.e., Putin is working 24/7 to fulfill, to realize two goals which go in parallel. To convince the Americans that he is so strong that he can't be touched, and just don't even think about regime change. But also to convince his own population that he is very strong, that Russia is a respected number 2 superpower, that Russian interests are very well taken care of by Putin, and that should be that way, that it should remain that way. As I already said, also as we're summing up, to this we have a third goal, which is not articulated, but which is very important. This policy is seen as the only policy that will ensure that the current Russian regime survives, that it survives not only physically intact, but also with all its assets under control. And because of that, I would venture to say that only extremely hard circumstances at home can scale back this type of foreign policy. And of course, we've seen in the last year or so certain changes domestically, economic and social changes, which show that the public is starting to get weary and tired of this expansionist foreign policy, because it started to realize that this foreign policy, all this glory, glory, hallelujah thing, happens at the expense of its pensions, its salaries, its well-being. Whether this is a trend that will grow and impact Putin's policy, I think remains to be seen. I think it will grow, not very fast, but it will. This will have an impact. But I think that it's yet too early to say that we will see a change in policy in the coming months or so. Putin still aims at a long run, and he is not known for innovative thinking in the last few years. He thinks that what worked for him before will work for him in the future. So I think that in the foreseeable future we'll have more of the same. But again, I don't like the idea of a black swan, but for lack of better metaphor, I will use it. But black swans are coming, I'm sure. And if they do come to Russia, Putin will have to make very, very hard decisions. And the more inflexible he is now, the harder these decisions will be. So thanks, I'll stop here and take your questions.
Shaul?
Yes, I hear you. Anybody wants to ask questions or comments? But before going to comments, please, a question, please.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would if I can. Go ahead. Hi. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very, very interesting. You said that he wants to be seen as sort of the dictator of all dictators who will support autocrats wherever they are. I have two questions. One is, do you think that it's really any autocrat, or it's specifically in places that will upset, that will be a thorn in the U.S.'s side? Venezuela, for instance, is a thorn in their side. Syria is a thorn in their side, but there could be dictators in Africa or in other places that are sort of neutral, and then maybe neither side has an interest. Would Putin still take the effort to support and help them? That's my first question. My second is, how do you see the recent drop in the price of oil affecting?
We don't hear the second part of your question.
Second question was about the price of oil, and if you, how do you think this is going to impact his ability to undertake the support of these ventures outside of Russia and even within Russia?
David, thank you very much for the question. Let me start with you're right. I mean, to some extent, you answered your own question. Of course, Putin can't take care of all dictators. Probably he won't be that much interested in the fate of, Omar Bongo's son or whatever in Africa. Or, of course, he's not omnipotent. You're right. He's interested in key places, in key challenges where the United States are involved and where the United States do not seem to be strong enough. And in this respect, it is part of his obsession with American regime change. So yes, I mean, he can't go all around doing that. But let us say Mr. not Nazarbayev now, but okay, it's still Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, that's important. The Tajik leader, Rahmon, is important. Lukashenko is important. Assad is important for him. Promoting Haftar is important. Keeping Sisi in place and in one bit is important. I think that keeping, even to some extent, keeping Erdogan, because Erdogan will continue the policies of creating headaches for NATO all the time. So I think that that is important. And you're right. I mean, you answered your own question. Number two, oil price. Very good question. I think the problem for Putin is, of course, that his main source of income is now pretty much gone. I think that he is in certain trouble here, and he's been making noises in the run-up to V-Day, a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, saying, why doesn't the West go back to the policies we all had in World War II when we all cooperated? So lots of people noticed that and said, hey, he needs money, which is probably true. But you have to remember, he still has very, very large reserves, which he didn't use. Just to give you an example, on average, a member of EU spent anything between 5 and 10% of GDP on bailing out their economy. I'm currently in Lithuania. Lithuania, which is not the richest country in the EU, spent 10% of GDP on helping business, helping the labor markets, and trying to kickstart the economy. Now we're coming out of isolation. Russian government has spent no more than 2.4, that's max, of its GDP on propping up the economy. Putin wants to be there for a long haul. And that means that he wants to, save money for the emergency when he really has huge social upheaval in Russia, which he may. But also, as far as I understand, to keep his current policy going. Now, if you ask me, in case he is forced to cut down on external engagements. I'll give you I may be wrong, but I'll have my sort of, if you wish, hit parade chart of how he's going to de-escalate his involvement. I think that he will leave Libya alone first. Then he will try and announce for a 15th time yet another victory in Syria, but really try to leave. And then he will try and get some kind of agreement about Donbass, but that will be very hard, because in practical terms, I told you that he's obsessed with the United States. But the second thing after the United States, in practical terms, is Ukraine. That's the most important thing on Putin's mind after keeping himself in the Kremlin and in one piece and dealing with the White House. So, yes, doing something about Donbass may be a third thing. But again, Russian engagement in Libya, Syria, and in Donbass is not very expensive. At least wasn't until now. In Libya, you have mostly the Wagner guys. So, okay, a few provincial Russian alcoholics killed in near Benghazi, who cares? Syria, okay, you have the Wagnerites, plus the Air Force support for the Assad troops for Hezbollah, whatever. Well, that's not very expensive, really. I mean, it's marginally more expensive than Libya, but it isn't, really. It's not something that registers in the Russian budget too much. Donbass is more important, because in a sense, this kind of bit of eastern Ukraine is under Russian control, is de facto Russian. But thing is that most of the Donbassovites, I don't know how to call them, they already got their Russian passports. They all work as taxi drivers in Rostov and in Moscow. They don't know where the Red Square is, but it doesn't matter. So, in a sense, they are already bringing some economic benefits. It's like, you know, the Central Asian guest workers. They are sending money home. So, in a sense, they are keeping their women and children more or less afloat. So what you have again, military supporting Donbass militarily. Okay, Ukrainian army is much better than it used to be 5 years ago, but no one is talking about an all-out war. So I think for now, he will be much more focused on domestic issues. He's not going to be too expansionist for now. But I don't see him trying to cut back on anything. He still has this, it's like someone who's jobless, who lost his business, but still thinks he can keep his Mercedes instead of moving on to Ford Focus. That's more or less, I think, his thinking now. It may change. But to make him change, you have to get someone to come into his office and convince him that has to change. There are not too many people who can do that, as is usually with this kind of Louis XIV type of rulers, who live in this court, surrounded by the court, which also only tells them what they want to hear. Take the coronavirus. I'll give you one example of decision-making. Russia could have been in a much, well, not much, but in a better position with coronavirus. If it wasn't for Putin's entourage not being able to tell him that the situation is not going to go away, it's really bad, the Chinese really ripped up the whole world. In the end, they had to find the mayor of Moscow, Mr. Sobyanin, who used to be Putin's chief of staff, to come, and he could muster the strength for personal reasons to tell Putin to his face that he needs to shut the whole thing down. 2 weeks of all these guys calling each other and saying, yeah, just can you go and do that? Ivan Ivanovich, no, I can't do that. Maybe Ivan Petrovich can do it. No, you know, I'm also afraid. In the end, they all found Sobyanin to do that. So in this respect, decision-making here, as I said, is very opaque. And sometimes not fully, I'm not saying not completely based on reality, but sometimes not fully based on reality. I hope I answered your question.
So does somebody else have any question?
Yeah, I have a question and a half. It's Benny.
Yes, Ben.
Yeah.
Shalom.
First of all, it's really a very impressive briefing. I wrote down some questions, and every time I finish to write the question, you get the answer. So I left with 2 questions only. For years, we were living on the impression that the main reason, or maybe one of the main reasons of Russian interest in the Eastern Mediterranean is to have some access to warm waters. And now I didn't hear even one indication about this so-called main reason. Is it passé, or they still want some kind of access from the Black Sea, or maybe from the Baltic, to warm water? My other question is, maybe you can say a few words about the policy in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, mainly China and North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Benny. On the first question, let me put it like that. This access to warm waters is not, to me, it's not the chief reason for that. It's been a bit more, let's say, exacerbated when Putin got the Crimea. But at the same time, you asked Tzvi, he knows better, but as far as I understand, I'm not a specialist in the Navy issues, but the Russian Black Sea Fleet is not exactly the most modern fleet in the world. Yes, you still have to get out of the Black Sea, and you still have to rely on Turkey's good wishes on the Montreux Convention to get access to the Ladiki and Tartus basin. Now, the reason to enhance Russian presence in the Mediterranean is if Russia gets a very significant foothold in Libya. It's still far away from it. But if Russia gets this foothold, if Russia becomes the main player in the Libyan energy field, if the Gazprom Nefts and the Rosnefts and the whatever of this world get a lot of contracts there, then this presence becomes a bit more validated, at least economically. And then you have a reason to argue that you should modernize your fleet. And so, yeah, there is certain modernization. Since 2007, since the days of the only non-military defense minister in Putin's or even Yeltsin's days, for that matter, Mr. Serdyukov, who used to be a furniture salesman. Russian modernization of the armed forces really goes bit by bit. It does go up. But I think that the Navy is still a fairly, I wouldn't say unimportant, but it's not as important as ground forces, or let us say the Air Force. If you look at the activity of the Russian Air Force, it is really quite significant. It's been beefed up very much since the, especially since the days of, since the intervention in Syria. Also, it's a better way of projecting your image, impressing it on the US, because you can send a 295 to fly over the Hebrides or to Newfoundland or wherever. Russian ships, well, you know, compared to, say, US fleet, they don't look fantastic. So, and they're prone to accidents, as you know, and they are not very well maintained. So I think to some extent, this warm waters thing is a bit from the, you know, Jeffrey Hosking, James Billington books about, you know, Byzantium and the Eastern question and things. It's relevant. It's something that they talk about in the, as far as I understand, in the Academy of General Staff, but it's not the overarching thing. It's not Nicholas II with the Straits obsession. With regard to China, it's a whole huge area of debate and discussion. We just discussed it this morning with Tzvi, actually. and I'll share with you my impression that I have. Look, Chinese and Russian influence and might are simply incomparable. They're not standing together. Russian GDP is close to that of Spain. It's 10 times less than the Chinese. The Chinese, in nominal terms, is I think 14 or 15 trillion. Russian is 1.4, 1.5. Russia is in demographic decline since the days of the Gulag. It is actually spending a fraction of what the Chinese spend on defense. All men under arms in Russia equal about 1 million people. China has a 2 million strong armed force, and that's, I think, not counting the police, with 1 million reservists. What are we talking about, really? The only problem is that, and also Russia has 4,100 kilometers of border with China, the longest. And just to give you a very important illustration, the population of Russia from the Urals Mountains to the Sakhalin Island is 27 million people. That's official figures. The population of the 3 Chinese provinces that border Russia, which are not the richest ones, that includes Xinjiang, is 90 million people. When you go to Blagoveshchensk, which is right across from Kharkiv, you arrive in a city of 200,000 people and dying, and right about 2 kilometers, you see skyscrapers, really. I mean, there's no skyscraper in Blagoveshchensk, never will be. And there's about 3 or 4 million people. It's a porous border. I would say that, especially after the Corona crisis, China is the biggest challenge to Russian national security, objectively speaking, but not for Putin. I don't know what people in the general staff and the SVR are thinking. Probably somewhere when they are under the blanket with their wives, they probably write some notes about Chinese threat. But we don't see it anywhere in the open. Putin's, I think, he realizes the disparities. He realizes on 2 things. Nuclear deterrent, so he thinks that, okay, the Chinese are never going to do any hanky-panky to me because I can strike them mightily. And actually, I think it's only the nuclear deterrent where the balance is in Russia's favor. I think that Putin's idea is that you don't pick a fight with China. And actually, if on some issues we have to play second fiddle to the Chinese, so be it. You can't stop Chinese expansion in Central Asia because Russia is not going to invest in Tajikistan the money that the Chinese are ready to invest. So the idea is that, okay, we'll play second fiddle. We'll be, in certain ways, a junior partner. But that ensures that when the Chinese pick up, the economy picks up, they will continue to buy our oil. And another thing, we have one very important thing in common. We both dislike the United States. That is worth a lot of things. And in this respect, you see that Putin and Lavrov, in situations when they were completely uncalled for, made the remarks about how we shouldn't accuse China of spreading the coronavirus, how China is a very responsible global stakeholder, and all this kind of rhetoric from the Stone Age, which only happened like 2 months ago, as you know, but we lived in the Stone Age then. So I think that Putin knows the limits, he knows the red lines. For example, he's not letting the Chinese into Russian state corporations. When the Chinese wanted to get 10% of Russian railways in exchange for giving away free technology of producing high-speed trains. They wanted to nominate 1 or 2 members of the board. Putin said, thank you very much, but no. He really knows where his assets are. He wants to keep them separate. On the other hand, look, Rosneft and Transneft are in debt to China to the tune of, I think by now, it used to be 25 billion, now it's about 20 billion, against future future deliveries of oil? Well, look, it's going to take a long time before the Chinese buy all this oil and compensate for the credit. So, in a sense, they are already tied with the Chinese. I think that this very uneasy relationship will continue. The Chinese will continue to expand in Russia's soft underbelly in Central Asia. This is the new great game which Russia's already lost. I traveled to Kazakhstan, I see it. And by the way, I see a lot of desire for Russia to play a bigger role. However, a lot will depend on, again, the United States and the global West. Whether the global West will make this pushback against Chinese expansionism. If this pushback is hard enough, Putin will recognize this strength. And he will probably even use it in his dealings with Xi Jinping. But for them, has to feel that this strength and this pushback is so hard that he can allow himself to play this game. I'm not saying he's in love with the Chinese. What I'm saying is that he, in a certain way, he can't avoid China. These 4,000 kilometers count for something. And he can't really go to the West and say, sorry, I do want to make peace. I do want to be a partner of NATO because I'm afraid of these guys in the East. Because that will mean essentially completely dismantling 20 years of his legacy. I think that will be the choice, and that will be a sine qua non for the foreign policy of whoever comes after Putin. But we have to wait for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions, please.
Yes, I would like to ask a question.
Avinoam?
Okay, good. Thank you, Konstantin, for your very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you two questions. First is regarding the oligarchs issue. Mm-hmm. And my question, well, we know, I follow Russia already 40 years, and Putin, the president, Putin took control over the oligarchs. I think that was 3 months after he came into his power. And following this fact, I would like to ask you, would you agree that the oligarchs in Russia and abroad are almost totally dependent on the Kremlin, and then the Putin is using the oligarchs as a tool to promote his interest, Russia interest, whatever? This is my first question. And the second one is regarding what we used to call personal diplomacy. And you described a very interesting the Putin's attitude regarding our Prime Minister Netanyahu. But from other perspective, I would say sometimes a bit problematic. These very close relations between two leaders, and sometimes you don't really know what's going on in between. And we know the case of the President Putin and Schroeder in Germany. So would you agree that this type of relation between two leaders is a bit problematic? And would you say, are there any other examples from these relations between Putin and some other leaders in the region? That's my second question. Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, the short answer is yes. When people, you remember what I said about Lavrov, right, in the beginning. So when you say oligarchs, you think about the same thing that you think about Lavrov. These people are nobodies. They are allowed to keep their assets for as long as the Kremlin allows them to keep them. They are allowed to enrich themselves to astronomical levels, though not Chinese levels. And at the same time, they are to be there at hand to do Putin's bidding, whether it's financing the Olympic Games or financing mercenaries in Donbass or flying arms to the Wagner Group or doing PR like it is with the Jewish organizations. Let's face it, there's Putin's people do work on that very, very hard, especially when it touches upon Central and Eastern Europe. But oligarchs play no independent role. It's not like Yeltsin days. After the arrest and imprisonment of Misha Khodorkovsky, all questions of oligarchs ever being independent were kind of closed once and for all. And as long as Putin is there, it will remain so. I know I once asked, and that was, I like the story very much. Tzvi heard it. And he even knows the person. I asked, a very, very highly placed person who used to work very closely with Putin, who is now, I wouldn't say retired, but he managed to leave the ruling circles very, very soon after the Crimea, round about the Crimean annexation, because he has very good sense of smell, and he's relatively young. So he decided to jump ship and become a very unimportant business executive. When I asked him, tell me, now that you have sanctions, you have the whole world against Putin for a long time now, at least the West, do you think that it can provoke some kind of, I would say revolt, but unease at the top? And he said to me, well, you know what? All these people at the top, including the oligarchs, will only revolt against Putin if revolting against Putin is or inspires less fear than what happens on the street of Moscow. It's when everything is in chaos and Putin can control it, maybe they will move, but not before that, because they all saw Khodorkovsky behind bars. And they know that for each and every one of them, there is a file as thick as that. And they can be imprisoned anytime. They are completely, I mean, you have to understand, the Russian elite, the Russian ruling class, lives in a really completely transparent police state. There is nothing that the FSB wouldn't know about. And I suppose that because of that, you can't speak about these people as an independent players. Now, when everything starts to calm down, then maybe. But I think that there is one qualification to that now. I think that not immediately, but there will be repercussions of the coronavirus crisis. Because what Putin showed, his reaction to the crisis, very muted, very irresolute, very hands-offish, very much trying to push the issue towards, the governors, Prime Minister Mishustin, Mayor Sobyanin, whoever, has shown to many that his macho image is only an image. That he's in fact a man of 67, averse to risk, very rich, doesn't want to take responsibility. I think that this is impressed on the general public. Tentative public opinion polls show it. What I'm sure of, and that you can't measure, what I'm sure of, this crisis has moved us a little bit closer to this, the death of Stalin film. I.e., lots of people sitting around Putin, those who are very loyal to him, on surface, will say, wow, we'll have to deal with this dedushka for another 16 years? We'll get old by that time. We won't have a chance. Moreover, he's so irresolute and weak that he's not, when we are in trouble, he's not ready to provide leadership. Even if Russia gets out of this crisis, more or less, I think that it will, with huge losses, of course. Putin's image will be dented, and first and foremost of all, in his inner circle. So I'm looking forward to maybe a less cohesive ruling class. It's another question, if Putin feels it, how will he react? There are two ways of doing that. You either imprison a couple of guys and to show everyone else that you are still you're an old dog, but you're an alert dog. Another thing is to start yet another small victorious war. Invading Daugavpils for 24 hours, something like that. But that's another story. Now, personal diplomacy. It's important. Schroeder is a bit of an exception because Schroeder is essentially bought. And Schroeder is someone who was completely ready to forsake the image of a democratic German politician for money. Putin is constantly on the lookout for people who can be bought. Bought in a different sense of word, with money, with flattery, with influence. He's good at that. I think he was a very good student of operative psychology as it's taught in the KGB school. And I think that he's, in this respect, he deploys that. For example, dealing with Israel. You know, especially when interests coincide. He hates Central and Eastern Europe because Central and Eastern Europe are the people that are constantly reminding the world about Ukraine and, you know, things like that. So, okay, what we do, we go and tell lots of Israeli decision makers, opinion makers, and so forth, oh, these are all sort of anti-Semitic Latvian legionnaires. And a lot of money and effort is invested in that. Not because Putin is a great lover of Jewish people. I mean, he respects Jewish people and has fear of Jewish people, as I told you. But it coincides with his interests, so why not? And of course, I think Netanyahu realizes it. He realizes that Putin is like an adolescent who is devoid of love definitely since he invaded the Crimea. So Netanyahu comes, puts on the St. George ribbon on his lapel. Putin's heart melts because of that. So this value of symbols diplomacy for Putin is important because, as I said, strength and respect are very important. So if you show him respect, well, you can get something out. And I think that in the Middle East, I don't think that his relationship with Assad, I don't think it's fully respect in the sense that because he knows that Assad is dependent on him. I don't know whether he realizes that he now depends on Assad too, in some way. I think that he still has some respect for Erdogan, and I think that his desire to humiliate him, when you saw him making Erdogan wait in the anteroom, was probably his way of getting even for the shutdown playing, for a lot of things. But still there is respect because he will always remember the plan. And I think there is some respect for Sisi. I think that he sees Sisi as, well, a potential big strategic partner. And if they finally get their game in Libya, then Egypt will be put. But secondly, also because, you know, he's the secular ruler, he lives under the threat of assassination every day. Sadat was assassinated in '81, and they had Tahrir, and they had blah, 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 blah. All this is important because Sisi has this image of, it's nearly, you know, Stalin-esque marshal. So in this respect, for Putin, image is important because image always has something to do with strength, weakness, respect, lack of respect. So psychologically for him, that's important. Of course, those he buys in Europe, I don't know, extreme left, extreme right, doesn't matter. He doesn't respect. But by the way, I think there's one thing I would like to tell you, and that may be relevant to this question. We're talking about Eastern Mediterranean. Greece and Turkey, Greece and Cyprus are, well, of relative importance to you and to Putin. And here you have a situation in which you have no respect, but basically a complete naked attempt to buy influence. Cyprus, well, third largest investor in Russia, notionally, for obvious reasons. So yes, it is important, but you know, how much does a Cyprus president cost? I mean, not much, probably. I always wanted the Royal Air Force to, you know, make their planes take off from Akrotiri and bomb Nicosia to, you know, to nothing, or presidential palace in Nicosia at least. So if Putin doesn't have to deal with, you know, people and make them feel they're respected. I mean, if he doesn't have to play personal diplomacy game, he wouldn't. It's easier to send a few suitcases of cash. The same goes for, say, Greece. With an additional, and of course, as you know, an additional element in Greece and Cyprus is that the two have very old communist-based agents and influence networks ever since the days of the Politburo. So here it's a fairly close relationship, which is also, of course, fed by this, you know, Orthodox Brotherhood and things like that. On the surface, or the Greeks, they look down on the Russians. They taught us faith, not vice versa. So, what is there? So this is a case where there's a lot of personal connections, but not the way you speak about it. Putin doesn't have to invest in that. But I also think, and there's an important element here, when we're speaking about Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, Israel, and generally the West, of course, there's one thing that is very similar to the Chinese in the Russian thinking. You know, in the end, the Greeks or the Cypriots, if they're faced with a stark choice between Moscow and Brussels, you know what they will choose. They will never choose Moscow. Because of a lot of links, because of, in the end, democratic decision-making, because of participation in multilateral organizations, which have their downsides, but have a lot of upsides. And also, to some extent, because of political similarity. That's where, you know, democracy and stuff like that come into play. The fact that, well, there are some Greeks studying in Moscow University, but how many Greeks study in Bremen or Oxford or University of Salamanca or Sorbonne, right? I mean, just don't even compare it. This Putin doesn't understand, just like the Chinese. And I think that in this respect, for them, yes, they can talk about the Rothschilds and things, but Israel for them is Israel. It's not part of the global West. Because the fact that Israel is a democracy doesn't register that much. And I think that this is an important element of their thinking. You know, cynics are usually right. But when they're wrong big time. And I think this is a lesson which Putin, well, had a few chances to learn, but still hasn't. No, I don't think so. I hope I answered your question.
Konstantin, I start to ask you about technology and the way Putin is trying to, let's say, to push technology, to push innovation. I try to follow his March to 2018 message with these 4 innovations, you know, with the underwater torpedo, with the nuclear warhead, with the supersonic missile, and then followed some accidents. I have a discussion with Zvi, and Zvi tried to explain me that it's some kind of a battle between some kind of organization who try to get money, but it's not the organization, it's Putin, because he mentioned 4 technological innovation, maybe deterrence or not. How you foresee this?
First of all, when you are Russian and when you follow Putin, in the end you unfollow him in many ways. For example, you don't follow his promises. For 20 years, we had Putin's plan number one, Putin's plan number two, modernization of this, modernization of that. In 2015, I think, in his, at that time, it's an epochal interview, which was part of a big documentary about the annexation of the Crimea. He said that Russian cosmonauts will land on Mars in 2019. So Putin's technology expertise leaves a lot to be desired, frankly speaking. I think that, on the other hand, speaking about the military, there is some innovation. I mentioned that. For example, some of the, as I said, I'm not a military technology expert, but some of the, say, as far as I understand, shore-to-ship missiles are supposed to be really pretty new. As far as I understand, some of the Russian cruise missiles are not bad. The issue is that you can't really produce a lot of them because there is no production capacity to match even whatever half of what the United States has. So I think that Putin is interested in military technology and he understands the value of modernizing the military. But question is, as always with any technological modernization in Russia, is that it's corruption, first and foremost. The cost of producing anything, you can easily multiply by 5 because so much money will be stolen along the way with kickbacks and things like that. Basically, it takes a longer time, and moreover, the longer you work on that, the more money you can squeeze from the Kremlin. Also, I think that isolation from especially the isolation that that has roots in the general in the general mistrust vis-a-vis Russia with regard to its policies after, especially the Crimea, hampers definitely getting new technology, and also the issue is that you have brain drain. Most of the young physicists or chemists or biologists or whatever, when they enter the, say, Moscow University Physics faculty, which is one of the topmost physics schools in Russia, probably the topmost, second, depending on, there's another. I think that by the age of 20, most of them already know which American or British university or Israeli university they will go to. So there is a huge effort to retain workforce that can work on these new technologies, new models of weapons. And I think that only recently the trend of aging of the industrial workforce was, if not reversed, then stopped. I think that if the only figure that my weak head retains is that about 7-8 years ago, average age of an industrial worker, and industrial worker in Russia means 50% military, was about 62 years. Okay, well, now you have to retire later, but I mean, you don't reverse these things in 7, 8, 10 years without huge effort. Such effort wasn't made. So I suppose that although these developments will happen, the overall capacity of the Russian military industrial complex is weakened by these factors and will continue to be weakened. Because I do not see how, after the Corona crisis, there will be even more people willing to leave. It's another matter whether we have the money to do it. So I think that the main issue, if you want me to give you 2 main issues, it's actually corruption is number 1, and physical shortage of personnel. There may be very good brains, and you may attract them, but there are not enough of them, I think. As there are, and it's even probably more important, there are not enough, the number of people that can physically produce things is not enough to. These are the two hampering things. Of course, you can recoup these things with, say, active espionage. But now with everyone looking for the guys who try to kill Skripal all over the world, I mean, you're also you're also in the focus of unpleasant attention much more than you were 10 years ago. This is really easy. So it's going on. Putin pays attention to modernization. There's no doubt about that. He's one of the things he's focused on, apart from his survival. But his corridor of maneuver is not huge. Look at what happens with Roscosmos. It's like a Carmen operetta. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's corruption upon corruption upon corruption. No one is punished. It's really some kind of Tom Sharp novel. But this is reality. It's not happening on Netflix. It's happening right here and now in Russia. And that's space. Come on, it's important.
Thank you.
Cheers.
More questions?
Yes, please. What is your assumption about the North Path and the Arctics as a solution for both economical adventures and as well as the probable connection with the Chinese as producing a North BRI path on that?
Ido, thanks for the question. There was a lot of talk about the Arctic 4, 5, 6 years ago, when the Arctic was this kind of big hit around the world, you know, melting of the permafrost, how we're going to have new agriculture there and things like that. Now, I think for some reason, it's a bit on the back burner. There are several, I think that the causes of that are that, first of all, there is not enough, it's a very hard access area. So you have to invest quite a lot there. Until now, the main driver of development, and I'm telling it to you as a former vice president of ExxonMobil in Russia, was the oil and gas sector. Now, that's not going to develop for a long time now. Not only because of the slump in oil demand and energy demand generally, but also because Russian oil and gas sector is under sanctions, in fact. And Russian oil and gas sector, which was supposed to be the driving force for the Russian Arctic, is starved of technology. Rosneft is not going to develop the offshore deposits for the next, well, until they liberate Donbass. I mean, it's going to be a long time. By that time, I don't think if Igor Sechin or Putin would be there. They can't do it without Western technology, without Western contractors. And you need a lot of very specific equipment, because in many ways, it's such an uncharted territory that you will need your service contractors, like, you know, Baker Hughes or Schlumberger, producing stuff specifically tailor-made, for example, these fields. They can't do it. And they can't be produced inside Russia. So what do you have? You have Norilsk, which is okay, it can be privately developed because it's essentially what it's an Axiom group. But not much else. I don't think that they will have the capacity to do it. The Chinese are looking forward. As you know, they completely, as far as I know, I'm not a big specialist on that, but as far as I know, they retooled their icebreaker fleet. And the fact that China has an icebreaker fleet in itself is very interesting. I think Russia has 2 icebreakers still, which is good, or whatever, 5. But in whatever, I mean, I don't know, very few as far as I understand. But anyway, I think this attention to the Arctic visibly diminished in the last few years. I think because they just don't have the time for it. And they don't have the time for it because it's too long term. You're speaking about, okay, let us say the most optimistic, but you can call it optimistic because it's into the whole debate about climate change. But it's 30 years we're talking about, 40? Look, in Russia, no one plans for 2 years. The budget is planned for 3, okay. Forget it. They can't imagine 40 years. For example, I can't imagine $15 billion. I don't understand how they look. I mean, like, for me, it's complete abstraction. So for them, even 15 years is unimaginable. They are not thinking in this way. If you tell them that tomorrow you're going to have a lot of money by doing this or that in the Arctic, that's fine. In a year, fine. 3 years, maybe. Talking about this long-term development of Russia, no, forget it. It's just not on their mind. If the only way to do it is if sanctions are lifted, then probably Russian energy companies will resume activity, offshore activity. It also takes quite a bit of time for exploration, development, and things like that. That is it. I don't see anything else.
And the Chinese attitude, vice versa?
I think the Chinese are looking at it. It's another question that they are, well, it's still Russian waters, it's still very close to Russia. I mean, I think that the Chinese were careful not to do too much. They're sending signals, but as far as I understand, I haven't heard the Russians mentioning anything too much about either cooperation with the Chinese, recently at least, or any kind of, Chinese encroachments there. I understand that they have a certain interest, but I can't really say much more about it. It's not something that registers, because I see, for me, it's a peripheral issue. So what I see is only when something really registers big time. If you had a group of Chinese military ships sailing all the way from Sakhalin to Murmansk, everyone would ignore it. Yeah, but So I'm sorry, I can only give you generalities, mostly stemming from my own experience.
More question if you have?
Can I ask
Yes.
a second again, Shaul?
Yes, please. If Konstantin have still a...
I have another 10 minutes, yeah.
So, a few minutes. I promise you a very, very simple question. So my question is regarding the relation, the dynamical relation between Russia and Iran. And it's very easy to talk about the mutual interest. Would you relate to the conflict of interest between Russia and Iran? Of course, focused on Syria, but also in the other parts of the Caspian region and some other regions in the world, the conflict of interest between them.
Well, I think that the relationship between the Iranians and the Russians is very case specific, if I may say so. Yes, it's Syria. There's common interest, of course. It's the general, of course, dislike of the United States. That's common with, say, Chinese or Venezuelans or whatever. It's arms sales. The Chinese are, the Iranians, they buy Russian weapons, so, that is it. Also, of course, Bushehr and the whole nuclear thing. Mm-hmm. So I'd say this is a relationship which is very well anchored. Well, I mean, there are not too many countries with which Russia has a relationship which is diverse, long-term, because most of these things are, quite a lot of them are long-term. Caspian, yes, of course, and there are other things too. For example, let us say the whole issue of Azerbaijan, which is not exactly a very hot potato, but Russians will always be suspicious of the fact that they can impact events there if they want to. But I think that basically the relationship is based on the understanding that there are limits to it. It's not like an old treaty of friendship or something like that. First of all, it's psychological. There is traditional dislike in Iran of the Russians, just like in China. Former colonial power, plus colonial power that occupied Iran in a recent memory. So, okay. Number two, I think the Iranian leadership understands well that, as I said before, in a major confrontation, if there is a major confrontation between Iran and the United States or Iran and Israel, Russia will not participate. It will take a step back. Putin knows that there's one thing he's not going to do, because that opens such a Pandora's box of risks that he won't take them, even for the benefit of, tickling the US. So the Iranians know that in this respect, they're on their own. Yes, interplay in the UN, all this kind of block voting and things like that, that's fine. Yeah. But in the end, this is to me, the red line, the main border that separates the two countries. This is the fact that Russia is not a military ally of Iran in a global sense of the word. So also number three, I think, which I haven't been to Iran for many years, because I was blacklisted there for a long time as investigative reporter and then as a friend of the Shah's family. So I don't think I'm going there anytime soon. But my visits in the 90s, they proved to me one thing, that there is also among the Iranians, who are living, I mean the Iranian rulers, they also live in this fairly isolated bubble. They don't really understand the Western decision-making very well. There's also enough of suspicion and conspiracy thinking. Okay, all these Russian Jews in Israel, so Russia will never move against Israel. That means that the Israelis, in the end, they have a secret phone number to put. I mean, again, it's a bit of a satire, but well, you know how they think. Yeah. There's always this undercurrent. There's always these invisible forces, invisible movers and shakers that impact that. So Iranians have this feeling, and I think in this respect they try to develop this certain strategic autonomy, which will help them to survive. Again, to me, it's a survivalist regime. What Putin will be afraid of is if any American administration decides that it wants to go forward and support anti-regime forces inside Iran, not just by making Pompeo statements, yeah, but by really concerted effort. I think that here Putin will be scared because he'll think he's next. So I'd say it's a very pragmatic relationship with very well-defined confines. That's how I see it. Not completely without the conflicts, but if you look at it, well, for example, look at Afghanistan, well, more or less, the Iranians and the Russians were able to find a common ground. So I think it's less conflicting, and it's now tied by Syria. And that will be an important factor. The Iranians will know that if the Hezbollah guys are left without air cover, they may be trashed again. Not tomorrow, but they may be. So it's a very dynamic relationship, but I think, frankly, it's fairly stable. Let me put it like that.
Thank you.
I think that we consumed the time, and I would like to thank you very much, Konstantin. It was a very thorough, and I think it's very open. It's kind of a discussion, because I think that the answer, the question, put it as a point of discussion. I would like also to thank Zvi, because he promoted this idea, and I think that it was a good one. And I would like to invite you, whenever it will be possible, after this corona pandemic, to visit us and to have such a discussion face-to-face, even though today the Zoom is very popular and you can do sometimes better things in the Zoom that you are doing it face-to-face. But anyway, it was very thorough, it was very open, and I think that for us, it's another perspective when we are trying to evaluate what are the Russians are doing here, and it's very important to us. Zvi, if you want to say something before.
I have nothing to add. That I'm very glad that we succeeded to conduct this meeting, and I'm very hope that that it's not the last meeting.
Well, if I may, Haverim, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. I enjoyed your questions. I think it's always engaging when you feel that there is this kind of deep interest, deep professionalism at the other side of Zoom. Now everything is being streamed to Chinese servers from Zoom, so Chinese know my view of them since a long time. Look, I'd love to come to Israel, and I do hope that when I'm there, or if I'm there, rather when than if, I'm going to see you. I haven't been to Haifa for ages, so that'd be really lovely. And Zvi, thanks for organizing it, because for me, such things also mean that I can back and forth things. I can find out that I probably need to replenish my knowledge about something like about the Arctic. Any one of you, do feel free to contact me if you're writing something to ask for an opinion or for a quote or something like that. I'd be glad to oblige. So, you know, stay well, stay safe. Toda rabba and leitrot.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You. Thanks a
Thank you
million.
very much.
Oh, I would like to thank you specifically for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million. Bye-bye, guys. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.